Here in America, a lot of people like to throw around the C word. You know, communism. It's a classic tactic in politics to accuse your rival of being a secret communist. But what if America was actually communist? Like full-fledged Gulag Archipelago, mass famine, mustachioed dictator, blow up Mount Rushmore and make it Marx communist? How could American history have gone differently so that we had an actual communist dictatorship? Now, before we get into the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, let's rewind 140 years back to 1883. If you looked around, read the newspaper, you might think we were on the verge of an actual communist revolution. We're talking about the Gilded Age. Business was booming, railroads were zipping across the country, and you had John D. Rockefeller becoming the richest person in modern history. But the reason we call it the Gilded Age is because all that wealth was held by a small number of upper-class bourgeoisie businessmen. The top 10% of Americans held 75% of the national wealth, and the bottom 40% of the population held no wealth at all, especially new immigrants and African Americans. This economic system was kept in place through violence used against workers and through the legalized bribing of politicians. Kinda sounds familiar. But workers didn't just sit around. They forged unions like the Knights of Labor, the American Railway Union, and the IWW. These unions organized massive strikes over the years, but those strikes were crushed violently by the federal government. So, walking around New York City or Chicago, you'd find a huge urban working class with real terrible conditions, tenements, abject poverty, and they were willing to use violence on occasion to fight against such conditions. So if America continued along that path, we might have had an actual communist revolution. But what changed? Ultimately, those who wanted more moderate reform, the progressives, won through the democratic process. Chief among them was Teddy Roosevelt, a war hero and New York governor who was elected VP in 1900, then ascended to the presidency when President McKinley was shot by an anarchist in 1901. Now, that highlights an important distinction. On one hand, you have the anarchists and the communists as well, who wanted to overthrow the whole system. Then you had the progressives like Roosevelt and La Follette, who wanted higher taxes on corporations to break up our monopolies and some regulations in place to help the middle class. Because the progressives got elected and implemented some changes, most workers did not turn to communism. Over the course of the presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, progressive policies were signed into law, improving conditions a little bit. Now, not everything was perfect for workers. That's why they forged the IWW in 1905 and kept striking through the progressive era. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson weren't Eugene V. Debs or Norman Thomas, but they did buttress the idea of American democracy in a troubled time. The progressive movement eventually reached its peak under FDR, whose progressive policies brought the US out of the Great Depression. So whereas Russian czars poured water on the grease fire of working-class revolt, the US progressive movement stole its oxygen. That's why you got a communist revolution in Russia and not in America. Okay, so if you wanted an American communist revolution, just knock the knees out from the progressive movement. Let's rewind to 1901 when President McKinley was shot. McKinley was more concerned with tariffs and maintaining the gold standard than doing anything to help workers. If you want to prevent the progressive movement from making real changes and taking off, let's keep McKinley in office. His assassin, Leon Czolgosz, was pretty lucky in real life. He smuggled a gun beneath a handkerchief through a swarm of Secret Service agents into a meet and greet with President McKinley. Now, supposedly, those agents saw Czolgosz and thought his hand was just injured. Let's say Czolgosz doesn't get lucky, that one Secret Service agent asks him to show his hands, or that he misses McKinley, or that he doesn't really shoot him that well. If that happens, McKinley stays on as president for another 4 years. That means no Roosevelt presidency and no jumpstart to the progressive movement. Okay, so Roosevelt is delayed a little bit. Why can't he just run in 1904 though? Well, in those days, vice presidents did not usually get elected president. VP was kind of a dead-end job. In fact, the last guy who was elected to the presidency after being vice president was Martin Van Buren, and President Jackson was a lot more popular than McKinley. Roosevelt might run for the nomination anyways, but his youth and his reformist policies would scare away the party insiders, and that's who actually made the decision on the nomination. So it comes to 1904 and McKinley is still president. He's term limited, so Republicans go with a safe choice, the US Senator from Indiana, Charles W. Fairbanks. A trusted and sensible conservative whose most exciting attribute was his freaky mustache. For the next several elections, Republicans and Democrats nominate moderate or conservative candidates. Progressives might run a third-party candidate, but those never win because Roosevelt never broke the proverbial glass ceiling for progressives. Because of this, the Gilded Age continues another 20 years. Progressive policies are shunned, with no new major federal laws to lift wages, empower unions, or challenge corporate power and corruption. This also means that none of the progressive constitutional amendments get passed, so no federal income tax, no mandatory direct election of US senators, no prohibition, and no women's suffrage. Tensions rise much more than they did in real life. Workers strike often, and those strikes are put down with growing violence and casualties. When the US joins World War I, and it probably would anyways, even if there wasn't a progressive president like Wilson, the government uses the war as an excuse to crack down on left-wing political movements, just like President Wilson did in real life, but to a much higher degree. Imagine thousands of people sent to prison for opposing the draft, for example. In late 1917, newspapers in the US published reports from Russia. The communist Bolsheviks have taken over in another revolution. Many on the American left begin to support the radical vanguardism, which seems to have worked in Russia. This happened in real life. In 1919, the Communist Party of America was born. 1919 also represents a peak of violence in the United States, in real life, as well as in this scenario. Alongside race riots across the country in which people lynched African Americans, including many veterans, you had the May Day riots to protest the arrest of the socialist leader Eugene V. Debs and the US intervention against the Bolsheviks in Russia. In this scenario, these would be doubly as bad. Thousands of striking workers march on Washington, D.C. to demand that President pardon Debs, pull U.S. troops out of Europe, and shorten their workdays. The president answers with bullets. The U.S. Army crushes the rioters, killing hundreds and forcing them to retreat. The revolution is strangled in the cradle. Now, in real life, 1919 marked the beginning of the first Red Scare, with a whole bunch of people in America panicking about immigrants, unions, and the threat of revolution. With the federal government solidly anti-progressive, it contributes greater forces to cracking down on leftist movements. In real life, you had the Palmer raids and bills which ban leftist literature. Imagine that, but to a greater extent. Thousands of immigrants get expelled from the country, thousands more get locked up, and FBI Director John Edgar Hoover is granted extensive authority to investigate and spy on people. The 1920s sees the worsening of tensions. While the upper class grows richer, workers' suffering is elevated. Strikes continue to be squashed by the army. Meanwhile, the left-wing movement sees the death of its two foremost leaders, Eugene V. Debs and C.E. Ruthenberg, the latter of which was the head of the Communist Party. This opens the gates for more radical men. Now, in real life, the US Communist Party did not commit acts of terror or devote itself to armed revolution. The Italian anarchists like Luigi Galleano did that. But in real life, the communists willingly backed Lenin and Stalin, so I'm sure with a hard enough shove, they'd embrace the Galleanists' tactics. As communist leader William Zebulon Foster wrote, "Capitalism will die sword in hand, fighting in vain to beat back the oncoming revolutionary proletariat." So, who led the Communist Party after Ruthenberg died? You had a few key figures, including J. Lovestone, James Cannon, the mustachioed Earl Broder, but foremost among them is William Zebulon Foster. In this way worse 1920s, these men organized revolutionary cells in major cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Detroit. They bomb police buildings, arm workers on strike, and raise Cain. Then, in 1929, Wall Street crashes. Things fall apart. Millions lose their life savings. People beg President Hoover to do something, but he remains convinced that this is simply another little hiccup and that the economy will fix itself. As the crisis deepens, U.S. unemployment skyrockets. Workers flock to major cities in search of meager wages and a little bread. None can be found. Animated by unions and the Communist Party, these workers use violence and force to seize control of city governments, creating communes in New York and Chicago. Classifying this as an insurrection, Hoover sends the US military to those cities and begins a siege. Violence erupts in the streets as Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur and General George Patton use light tanks to blast through barricades. The communes continue guerrilla fighting nonetheless. Meanwhile, the nation is set for a presidential election. Hoover doesn't even try for the Republican nomination. It goes to the old silent Cal Coolidge, who breaks his quiet to confront the national crisis. Democrats turn to the right and nominate the cactusy John Nance Garner of Texas, while the Progressive Party nominates the Kingfish, the big boss of Louisiana, Huey Long. There's no FDR campaign in this case, since progressives are excluded from the Democratic Party and New York is in flames, so nobody really likes Roosevelt. In July 1932, 40,000 veterans marched to Washington, D.C. to demand their bonus wages from World War I. They're called the Bonus Army. MacArthur and Patton attempt to disperse them, but they're overwhelmed. The veterans, enraged, take control of the capital city, forcing Hoover to flee and putting their commander, Walter W. Waters, in the White House. The capital has fallen. The U.S. Army takes it back in a month, but the damage is done. Photos of the burning Capitol dome spread across the country just in time for the presidential election. Meanwhile, the Communist Party and other leftist parties forge a popular front and run for government. In New York, William Zebulon Foster is nominated for governor and wins the November election thanks more so to bullets and pressure than actual votes. Other populist front candidates win in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, and across New England. Meanwhile, the country votes Huey Long to be its next president of the United States. This is nicknamed the November Revolution. Long is sworn into office in March and forges an alliance with the Popular Front, swearing to confront the national crisis. However, Huey Long finds that the Washington March just won't give in. For one, the US military has its own agenda. When workers take control of Philadelphia to demand quicker action, the US Army shoots them down, killing dozens upon dozens. Similar events happen across the country, but anarchists and the communists shoot back. In July 1933, an anarchist sneaks a handgun beneath a handkerchief into a meet and greet with the president. He shoots him twice, killing President Huey Long. No new president is sworn in. Instead, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur takes power in the capital city, proclaiming a new emergency government with himself as the supreme commander. The Popular Front state governments refuse to acknowledge MacArthur's power, instead proclaiming their independence in the July Revolution. A second American Civil War has begun. Fighting is chaotic and multidimensional. On one side, you have the Popular Front, which is soon dominated by the Communist Party, with its radicalized militias of African Americans in the South and its loyal workers' unions in the northern cities, including many World War I veterans. Against them is the MacArthur government, which controls D.C. and right-wing states across the Bible Belt, including fascist militias like the KKK. Then you have separatist forces. The states of California and Texas, with the strongest separate identities, leap for the lifeboats, proclaiming independence. The American Civil War quickly attracts foreign volunteers. Many Canadians, Mexicans, Irishmen, Englishmen, and even Russians travel to the former US and take up arms for one side or the other. Despite having the loyalty of military officers, MacArthur's regime does not have the sympathy of the public or the vast number of new conscripts. Meanwhile, the Communist Party makes grand promises of utopia. It gains support and momentum, marching south. The Red Army takes Philadelphia in 1934, then Washington, D.C. itself in early 1935. The Supreme Commander flees the capital for Atlanta, but the Red Army catches up with him. MacArthur and his warlords hop on a boat to Britain, but he promises to return someday. After MacArthur's defeat in 1935, the Communists set about securing their domination over the rest of the country. State governments are abolished and replaced with workers' or farmers' councils loyal to the Communist Party. Texas is conquered, but a prolonged guerrilla war begins, and California falls in mid-1936. Insurrections remain across the country, though. Americans have a long history of political freedom and do not go down without a fight. The Communists spend the years until 1940 sweeping up anti-communist forces across the country, as well as revolutionary bands of their various ex-allies like the Socialists, Syndicalists, and Anarchists, forcing them at gunpoint to join the Red Army or die. By the end of 1937, however, the Communists control the key cities of the country. They gather for the first National Communist Congress in Chicago, with delegates from across the country cementing what everyone already knows: America is ruled now by the Communist Party. A new government is set in stone, the United Communist Councils of America, or the UCCA. The exact details of this new constitution are drafted by none other than William Zebulon Foster, the leader of the Communist Party and the Revolution. Conveniently, Foster wrote a book in real life about what he'd do if he ruled America. Basically, he would plagiarize the Soviet Union. This is no accident, since anyone who didn't really love Stalin was kicked out of the party. So what would Foster's Soviet America really look like? Okay, so far at the bottom are the thousands upon thousands of local councils across the country, organized by workers in cities and towns. With a limited slate of approved candidates, they elect leaders who elect leaders, and so on up a rising hierarchy to the national level, where Congress gathers in the capital of Chicago every few years to set the future of the party. This council elects a central executive committee, which meets every few months and covers important topics, which in turn elects a council of commissars, and above that a presidium, which handles the daily issues of government. All these positions are controlled exclusively by the Communist Party, which has a parallel structure. Just like the Soviet Union and eventually the People's Republic of China as well, the American Union is capped at the top by the chairman of the presidium, who in this case would be William Zebulon Foster. Since Lovestone and Cannon and other socialist leaders are purged in the 1920s for their ideological deviance, that leaves the mustachioed Earl Broder, who played a key role in the Red Army's campaign against MacArthur, to be Foster's second-in-command. Now, a lot of communists wanted autonomous districts for the minorities of the country, so judging from that and from other communist revolts like in Russia and China, we would expect the American Union to have several major states: the Communist Councils of America, Texas, California, and the South. These states are then divided into many districts based upon urban areas and ethnic borders, with Native American reservations and other minority areas being granted their own autonomous districts. These are not truly autonomous, of course, since they're controlled by the Communist Party. Beginning during the Second American Civil War and continuing afterward, the American Union nationalizes the economy across the whole country. That means industry, transportation, communication, housing, and the banks are all taken over by the state's Supreme Economic Council. Big farms, for example, are converted into collectivized agricultural communes. Wages are done away with, and everyone gets what they need by government distribution. Work is incentivized by patriotism and by gunpoint. Meanwhile, the so-called counter-revolutionaries are targeted. The first to get arrested by the new intelligence service are political enemies and businessmen like the Rockefellers, previous presidents, and congressmen. They're put on show trials, with the worst among them getting shot. Meanwhile, ideological foes are targeted, with basically anyone who doesn't profess absolute loyalty to the Communist Party being arrested and sent to labor camps across the country, with the worst being sent to the Rocky Mountains or even Alaska when the Communists take control of it. Meanwhile, the whole country is subjected to communist propaganda. The government controls all artistic production, all newspapers, all TV stations, all radios. The American people slowly have their cultural affinity to freedom and liberty worn away by ceaseless exposure to propaganda. As part of this grand cultural revolution to purge America of its bourgeoisie affects, cities across the country are renamed. Washington is renamed after Frederick Douglass, New York after Chairman Foster, San Francisco after a communist society in a Jack London book, Los Angeles after Fremont, and so on. Mount Rushmore, which at this point only had Washington's head, is redone with Marx, Foster, Browder, and Lincoln, since American communists kind of liked Abraham Lincoln a little bit. Meanwhile, thousands upon thousands of books are burned. This crisis, of course, gets the attention of the entire international community. Britain devotes some colonial forces to the Canadian border for the inevitable moment that the new UCCA invades, distracting it from the crisis in Europe. Now, in real life, the dictator of Germany, Adolf Hitler, wished for an alliance with Britain to fight against the Soviet Union. With America turning communist too, Britain might actually seriously consider such an alliance. Okay, so let's say Germany invades Poland in real life in 1939, with France declaring war against Germany. Britain half-heartedly joins the war, but in 1940, after France falls, makes peace with Germany to focus on the threat of communism. In 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. The UCCA sends aid to its brother in arms, but with the country in shambles, it's unlikely to make too much of a difference, rather than in real life, where America had a whole bunch of economic prosperity at this point. With Germany receiving aid from Britain, the UCCA mobilizes its army and invades Canada. This cements the divide between the Russo-American and Anglo-German alliances. Japan joins, attacking Pearl Harbor. War continues for the next decade. Germany slowly makes gains in Europe, sacking Leningrad, Stalingrad, then Moscow. It launches the largest campaign of mass murder in human history. Meanwhile, comparable violence happens in North America. Britain and Germany attempt to attack the UCCA through forging an alliance with conservative Catholic forces in Mexico, but the UCCA steamrolls over them, seizing major cities and purging anyone who doesn't obey the Communist Party. Rural forces continue an insurrection against the communist government, but they eventually are defeated. In Asia, Japan uses its land army to plunder China and its navy to sweep up the old colonial empires, seizing the islands of Hawaii, for example. Stuck in a stalemate, an armistice is signed in 1949, recognizing the spheres of influence of the world's new great powers. Soon after peace is signed, Chairman William Zebulon Foster of the UCCA falls to a mysterious illness and dies. His loyal lieutenant, Earl Broder, swiftly takes power as the new chairman. Browder and Foster were actually pretty ideologically similar. This isn't like a Stalin-Khrushchev situation. The new dictator doesn't change any of the totalitarian policies of his predecessor. Ideological variance is continued to be stamped out with violence, people are brainwashed with ceaseless propaganda, and the Communist Party completely dominates the whole of North America. So the world of the 1960s is a dark mirror of our own. Instead of two great powers, there are 3.5. Communist America, the crumbling British Empire, Nazi Germany, and the Japanese Empire. The UCCA is the first to develop nuclear weapons in 1954, but Germany and Japan soon follow. They compete in a shadow war for power and influence across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, always one miscalculation away from the complete and utter nuclear annihilation of human civilization and perhaps the human species as a whole. But maybe that would be a mercy. So, what do you think happens next? Would Communist America fall sooner than the Soviet Union did in real life? Would this nightmarish Cold War bring about inevitably nuclear war? Let me know if you'd like me to make a sequel, comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.